You are listening to the Hemp Startup Journey. My name is Jason De Los Santos, co-founder of Spectrum Labs, a hemp extraction facility in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm sitting down with hemp entrepreneurs, scientists, and politicians willing to share their perspectives, lessons learned, and how we can make an impact on the hemp and cannabis industry for everyone. Hey guys, Jason here with Spectrum Labs. Just a quick intro before we start the podcast. And this conversation is with Rod Kight. He's an attorney out of Asheville, North Carolina. He specializes in hemp and cannabis. And I had a great conversation every time that I speak with Rod. This is actually our second podcast conversation, and I'll link to the first one in the show notes. So check that one out if you haven't listened to it yet. It focuses mainly around USDA regulations when we talked back in November 2019. And a lot of those things are still pretty applicable. So in this conversation, we talk about a little bit about some of the USDA regulations that are coming up. We talked about international hemp, which seems to be a pretty exciting topic nowadays. So if you're thinking about going internationally, Ron has some suggestions about how to do that. We also talk about legalization of marijuana in the United States and specifically in North Carolina. So that's where we both live. And I'm very interested in seeing how that will play out. Feels like North Carolina might be the last state to legalize marijuana, but we'll see about that. And we talk about a few other things. But I just encourage you to put some headphones in, listen. You can listen in the car, in your office, wherever. I'd appreciate it if you shared it. Really, it's one of our goals to share as much of the knowledge that's out there in the industry. I think if the more informed we are as people that are in this industry, the better the whole industry will be. And then finally, if you have any comments or suggestions about other topics that you want to learn, if you're really interested in something and just can't exactly figure out how to get the right information, shoot me an email or just contact me on LinkedIn, and let's see if we can find out some of those juicy topics that we're all trying to figure out. So thanks for listening, watching, wherever you are. And here is Rod Kight.
You put it in context, you're like, oh, okay, well, that's...
Yeah. So that's been fun. So really, I'm just been open to anything. So I've actually been learning one of the songs from Frozen 2 because we just went to watch that with the kids.
Right.
So we're like all singing and, they're loving it. And,
that's
so
really
hopefully
cool.
they kind of get some of that, like, oh, like music, maybe that's something I might be interested in.
Yeah.
So.
Well, good. I think that's fantastic. I love it. For me, it keeps me sane. Mm-hmm. And as much as I'm impassioned about this, ultimately, if you're working whatever every day of the week on something, it's a job, and so it's good to get away from that and do something in a different
just get out of it for sure. But then talking about your job, so you just got an awesome recognition, not just an awesome recognition, you got a super recognition. So you like that? I thought that was pretty good,
right?
So you just received the recognition for a super lawyer in cannabis law. Can you tell us about that? Like the name itself sounds amazing.
Yeah. So Super Lawyers is a group, and they go around, they do a state by state in different categories of law, workers' compensation, tax law, business law, or whatnot. And they have some sort of a process, and it's actually a intellectual property of theirs about how they determine who gets this. It's not an award, but a recognition as being a quote unquote super lawyer. And it has to do with some algorithms, but most importantly, peer review, where they go to other lawyers and they have nominations and ask people. So with super lawyers, the thing that really excites me about this one is it's the first time that super lawyers in North Carolina has had a special category for cannabis law. And so I got the super lawyer designation for cannabis law, and I'm the only lawyer in North Carolina that got that. So I'm excited about it.
That's awesome. You're going to take over just cannabis law all over the U.S.
That's the goal.
You're rocking it. If we can talk business for a second. So with I've just seen you grow, quote unquote, in the sense of your business and maybe just your brand getting out there and just being in more outlets. What's next for you? Like it seems like you're in a good place, at least from where I'm sitting. But what are you trying to get to with your practice?
Sure. Well, I think with the practice, a lot of it is trying just to anticipate and then navigate the ever-changing regulatory landscape. So in some ways, I'm like my clients, in the sense that, we're all in this industry that's just exploding in all different directions. And so trying to find out, okay, where are my clients' needs going to be? How do I fit into that? And what are they going to need from me? So a lot of it is just forecasting in that respect. From a tangible standpoint, I see a couple of different things. First, the hemp industry itself and all its permutations continues to grow in the US. And so we're expanding our reach to cover clients there. The international space is something I'm very excited about, and that has to do a lot with hemp, but also with medical cannabis in particular, European countries, South American countries, and we're getting involved in that space. And then finally, being involved in the state by state level on the recreational adult use and also the medical cannabis. North Carolina will eventually have some sort of cannabis reform that's meaningful. And I look forward to representing people on the ground floor when that happens.
Yeah. And so when you say growing, so is that adding more attorneys to the practice?
It could be, right. So we try we're a lean and mean operation. I'm the principal. I'm here in Asheville, and then we have 3 associate attorneys, and they're intentionally in different cities. One's in Portland, Oregon, one's in Austin, Texas, one's in Greenville, South Carolina. And so that's to cover our bases with respect to time zones and licensing in different states and whatnot. And so we only grow to the extent that we need to. We really want to have that hands-on. We know our clients, they know us, they talk to us on the cell phone and have a quick question, that kind of thing. That's the kind of relationship we want. Not a big firm. You have to go through all the portals to get to the lawyer or the legal helper that you need.
Okay. So you don't want to have a practice of 500 lawyers.
That's not my goal. No. I like these personal relationships for sure.
All right. So you mentioned legalization in North Carolina.
Right.
Eventually, maybe the last state to be legalized. Is what it feels like.
Possibly it could be the last state.
But what are you hearing on that front for North Carolina specifically?
Well, North Carolina has had legalization bills, several over the past years. But the way the process works with our General Assembly, and every state's legislatures have their own different rules, is that you can only introduce certain types of bills at certain times. That's super vague, and that's partially because I don't want to get into the intricacies of it, and partially because I don't do legislative law. So I don't want to misstate myself. Sure. But the bottom line is we haven't been able to introduce a medical cannabis bill or any kind of marijuana bill for, I think, about a year. But this upcoming session, I believe we will. But, I think the election is going to change the landscape in a lot of different ways, but absolutely with respect to marijuana legalization. I think all of the Democratic presidential candidates, and in particular Bernie Sanders, are very much in favor of legalization of marijuana at a federal level. If that happens before it happens in North Carolina and other states on the state level, I think that will obviously push them. On the other hand, North Carolina is composed primarily, in fact, it's 2/3 supermajority of Republicans. And historically, they have blocked meaningful reform. Interestingly enough, as you probably well know, cannabis is one of those issues that is actually unites the parties. Obviously, there's a big disparity still between Democrats and Republicans on legalization, but that's something that a majority of Republicans and a majority, if not a supermajority of Democrats agree on. So I think all of that is to say that after this fall's election, I think we're going to see a big change in policy and bills that are being introduced in North Carolina and at the state level in other states and also at the federal level. Okay.
If you were a betting man, what would you say? How long do you think before North Carolina has legal in some form, whether for medicinal or recreational?
Well, I'll say that North Carolina will do the thing that traditionally happens, which is where you start with medical and then eventually may go to adult use. And that's a whole different conversation, by the way. I don't necessarily think that evolution has to happen. I think there are different tracks for adult use versus medical. There are different needs, but that's a different conversation or topic. With respect to the prediction, the looking into the crystal ball, I think it's possible, maybe even likely, that we'll have some legislation enacted within the next 18 months. But of course, that doesn't mean we'll have people can just go to the store and buy marijuana in 18 months, once the legislation is enacted, and then there's an implementation process that can take, years sometimes, as we've seen in other states like Florida and whatnot. But I think, we're looking at 2 to 4 years.
Okay. I wouldn't have expected that. I would have thought maybe 5+ years.
Well, you may be right, but I think that there's this tipping point thing that happens. And we do have a majority of states that have medical cannabis. And we are having, seems like every several months, another state will come online with adult use. And so at some point we may just have a tipping thing and it all happens pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll see about that. Let's see with, can we talk about labs a little bit? Yeah. I know last time we talked a little bit in the context of the USDA interim rules, and just wondering if you're having any conversations with clients in the sense of, hey, we have this product and we had to test it at this one lab and we didn't like what the lab said. And so therefore we took it to another lab. And so you have this very contrasting results. Where one lab could be, plus or minus by quite a few points as far as like, milligrams of whether it's CBD or THC or some other compound. What are you seeing there? And what's the truth? Like, where do you go to say like, okay, well, this lab is correct. If everybody says, oh, or not everybody, like the labs are comparable. Right. And whether they have GMP or ISO or whatever it is, like, how do you go to the source of truth and you say, this is the lab that I should believe in?
Right. Well, that's a great question. There are some really, really good analytical labs in the United States, and there are some that aren't so good. And the ones that aren't so good, in addition to not having, good operating protocols, good equipment, skilled personnel, really the primary issue is their willingness to bend to their customers' requests, to manipulate the data or the analysis. And fortunately, at least in my practice, I don't see that as often. And I like to think it's because I've got good clients doing the right thing, but as far as what to look for, I think some sort of a certification, ISO 9001 is a good certification for sure. Having a DEA license is going to be required potentially under the USDA interim final rule for pre-harvest testing. Is that necessary for post-harvest testing for products? It's not. There's no regulations that providing it. Having a DEA license requires some level of sophistication and experience and the willingness to go through that process. So I think it's an indicator that lab is going to be doing the right thing. And then as far as the equipment and protocols, it kind of depends on what you're looking for. What's the purpose of your testing? Are you looking to measure cannabinoid concentrations? Or are you looking for residual solvents and heavy metals and residual pesticides, or are you looking for mycotoxin and mold levels? Some labs can do all of that. Some can only do some of them. Some do it better than others. So that's a long way of saying, I think certainly look for the certification and whatever certifications they have, and ask them, say, this is what I'm looking for with my product. What's important to me? Are you able to test? And what is your, your deviation? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I've been trying to get a few of the lab like owners or presidents or CEOs on the podcast, and having a bit of a challenge.
Oh yeah, really?
People on this show, because it's important to us as an extraction lab in that we test things before we touch it, and we test it sometimes during the extraction just to make sure that we know how it's going, and then we test it certainly before the client gets it back. And we want, first of all, we want that integrity. We want to know what kind of losses or changes happen throughout the process, but then also so that the client knows, hey, I got a quality product and here's exactly what it is. But if a client says, well, I don't like it, right, and they send it somewhere else, and we test it in-house. We have a machine we test it in-house, and then we send it to a third party, but then the client might want another third party on their own, which is fine. Like, if they want to double check, but then sometimes we've had 3 different results. 3 different results.
Right. Exactly. Because there's so many variables out there, good and bad. Certain variables are just normal depending on the types of equipment and how they've been calibrated. And some are not normal and shouldn't be normal because it's not a good analysis. So, right. So you do some in-house testing as well.
Just for cannabinoids.
Gotcha. What kind of testing?
HPLC.
HPLC. Gotcha. So, right. And right now there's not, again, other than pre-harvest testing for hemp, there are no protocols or specific requirements for testing products. And so there are companies that will do their own in-house testing, and that's the results that they publish. Yeah. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong, but third-party independent testing is really that's the standard, and that's what people need to be moving towards.
I wonder if we need some sort of maybe in lieu of USDA labs, if we need, or DEA labs, if we need some sort of like open source protocols for the labs,
right?
If they would even go to that.
That's a great question. I'd be interested to hear what with these lab folks that you're reaching out to say about that. Open source has so many good qualities. I'm a big fan of wiki things in general, but that's not to say that certain labs may have their own IP in the way that they go about their testing and protocol that they don't want to reveal. So I understand that flip side of things, but some sort of open source, and certainly a standard that we can all rely on and say, well, this is the standard that we're looking to for these types of products or product categories. And also, what do we test for? Because different types of machinery's the wrong word, equipment. And, you've got to dial it in to look for different types of things. It's one thing if you're looking for cannabinoids versus, heavy metals versus mycotoxins. And so how do we gear up and look for all those things and what's necessary to look for?
So I think if I understand correctly, Tesla is open source, like the car company.
Is it really?
That's what I understand. I've never looked to see.
You haven't built a Tesla in your backyard with right.
But I think it's interesting to say that hey, we'll publish like our major findings at least, but you have to come up with the money to make the parts and the source and how to market it.
Right.
Like that's still the business. The business is not just the idea. Right. There's so much more to
absolutely.
it.
Well, you're doing that. You have clients come in and it might not be open source, but you're testing along the way and presumably sharing that with them. With our blog, it was important to me to write something that has some substance and meat to it that helps people. And that's different from providing specific legal advice. And so we have a goal of saying, well, here's an issue that we've identified as something that's new or novel or not. And here's an analysis of that we hope is helpful. And that's quote unquote open source, but someone may come to me and say, hey, my company, Acme Company, has this particular situation. And that's where the legal piece comes in. That's where we can actually consult and say, okay, well, with respect to your company and your particular situation, let's guide you through that. And to me, that's what lawyers do. And I like to provide as much open source, so to speak, as I can.
Yeah. And I think it's such an interesting concept that I don't know if you've noticed this, but the more information that you put out, like free advice, so to speak, that the more people, one, see you as an expert, and then two, maybe come to you and say like, oh, well, Rod knows his stuff, then I should go be his client. Where you would think, well, it might be the inverse where it's like, oh, well, I'm getting all this free information. I don't need somebody. Right. But that's not usually how it happens. Right.
And I think that's a big misunderstanding that a lot of lawyers have, frankly, that, oh, I've got to hide this information because that's what I have. And that's not, having information is not what lawyers do. Lawyers analyze information and laws, is specific to a situation for a client. So it's that analysis for the client piece and that guidance that they're paying for, not, oh, I have information that you don't have, so pay me for it. That's just not how it works, or certainly certainly not how it should work.
Yeah. What are you noticing with clients as much as you can speak? Like what are people coming to you for? What are the main issues that you're noticing, or maybe kind of trends with clients over the past few weeks or months?
Yeah, sure. So I'll try to say that so it's not a plug so we're Kight Law Office and here's what we do. But, just in general, so we are a business law firm that is limited to cannabis law issues, and we handle a significant number of our significant percentage is hemp and CBD issues. And we do handle the standard business stuff, mergers and acquisitions and business contracts and whatnot. We also do intellectual property. But a lot of that, and to kind of get to the point, a lot of what we're seeing with clients is just a need that they have to navigate these regulatory obstacles. Sometimes the regulations are complex. Sometimes they're new. Sometimes they conflict with other regulations from other jurisdictions. Sometimes it's just gray, and so we have to make some choices about how to proceed in the gray zone. So that's really, I would say, the primary thing that we're seeing is people coming to us with the regulatory needs. And, it's funny because every time a new regulation or law comes out, you think that it would be more clarifying. Oh, well, we don't need lawyers anymore because, now the law is this. It seems like things just get more complicated every time. So clients need more help. And frankly, that's how it is. If you're looking at the tax code, if you're looking at, estate planning or whatever, the laws are, complicated in all of those areas, and people need specific guidance for their situation. And so that's what we do. As far as issues that we're seeing more and more clients that are engaging in international trade. And that comes both ways with respect to the United States. Has to do, we're seeing people that are exporting products out of the United States into other countries, and that raises a lot of issues. And vice versa, we're seeing foreign companies wanting to export into the United States certain products. And that's a whole nother, you'd think it'd be the same in parallel, but it's a whole nother set of issues. So we're navigating those issues right now. we're seeing a lot of talk about what to do with extracts and distillates that are in a mid-stage process. How do you handle hot extracts, if at all? And of course, just the pricing and this issue where farmers have, gotten involved in contracts with processors, and processors have gotten involved in contracts with other manufacturers and for certain prices, and then the prices just dropped. And so everyone's bailing on their contracts,
right.
and breaching them and trying to move on and so that they don't lose money. It's just a wild ride. And so we're seeing a lot of people in that situation and trying to help them navigate it.
I've heard a few of those cases where some farmer brought their biomass to a lab, and for whatever reason, the lab folded or went bankrupt, or they were losing money or something like that. And so they said like, oh, well, here you go. We didn't do anything. And what about my deposit? Oh, sorry, we can't do anything about that.
It's right. It's out there. Well, in the United States in particular, we have what's called an efficient breach. And this is a concept in contract law. It's one of the first things I learned in law school, where the penalty for breach is dependent on the contract itself, but usually on some amount of losses. There's not, our laws are built such that people and companies can breach a contract if they deem it to be in their financial best interest to do so, taking all things in consideration, dealing with the party with whom they've breached, entering into a new contract with someone else. And that the idea is that this allows for the efficient flow of goods and services and capital, because if a better opportunity comes along or some unexpected price drop or price increase happens, they can breach and take advantage of that or mitigate their losses. And so I guess, the point I'm driving at is we see this happening, and it's really detrimental to a lot of parties, but it's also normal in the system that we have. And right now we're still in a situation where the solar system of cannabis and hemp in particular is being created, and planets are still, crashing into each other and losing their orbits and flying off into space. And it's going to be a little bit of time before we have orbits that we can count on and rely on, and that system is in a more static place.
Do you think that the USDA interim rules will have anything to do with that as far as sort of stabilizing the market?
Yeah, I think in some respects it will. Regulations typically, at least if they're well done, will add some certainty, which will help to create that more static space and reliable space. But of course, that depends on and assumes that the regulations are well written. And the interim final rule has several different problems that may create more issues. One is the DEA piece that we talked about. The requirement now or going forward will be that pre-harvest testing be done by a DEA licensed lab to handle Schedule I controlled substances. Well, as you and most of the readers are probably aware, we already had that was a spot where we're having some log jams and there aren't enough analytical labs as it is. And then to impose the requirement that they have their DEA license just radically reduces the number of labs that are available. So just creating a further bottleneck. So that's one thing that could cause some disruption in a bad way in the market. And that is the testing piece, and also the total THC, which is something I discuss a lot. That adds some certainty in the sense that, well, we know what's going to have to happen for pre-harvest testing, but it also is going to make things significantly more difficult for farmers and processors going forward. Yeah,
with the labs, we've tried so many different labs in the past few weeks, and most of them promise either like a 2nd-day turnaround or 2 to 3 day processing. We have not seen that. We have gotten results back at least 7 days out, if not more. And just to get any kind of good customer service has been just pretty terrible. And like, not saying to throw shade at the labs. I can understand that it can be challenging to not predict how much amount of work you're going to have.
Right.
I'm assuming that's part of it. Right. But it's still that I think that just kind of adds a sense of like, or leaves a bad taste in your mouth about the industry when you're in it. Like, man, this is a slowdown already. And if you do introduce DEA labs, what's that going to do?
Right.
You're going to have to wait months. That's impossible.
It's hard sometimes in this industry because it's, growing so rapidly to understand what's normal, what's not, what's good normal, what's not, in terms of customer service. Should you expect, response or turnaround within X number of days, or not, and under what circumstances is it okay to wait or to not get that customer service that you need. I mean, generally speaking, being able at least to communicate with the companies that you work with is important. So lack of communication is right off the bat a bad one, or a bad sign. But with respect to getting your results back, we want them back quickly because things are moving, but there's just not enough bandwidth out there for the labs that do exist for them to do that right now.
Yeah. I think one of my beefs with our industry, and I love what we do and what we're a part of, but I think I think this is getting a little bit better, but I feel like the lack of professionalism as a whole is like, it irritates me. It irks me so much.
Yeah.
And that could be from people being non-committal or just saying, oh, I'm going to do this, and they don't, or they never get back to you. And it's a lot more than that, but just, I think that professionalism, it lends itself to a like, hey, I'm doing what I said I will do.
Right.
And I think that there's a big,
it seems so basic, right?
Yeah.
But it's not out there a lot of times. I mean, that's the nature of I think probably any new industry, certainly something that's exciting for people. And I think if we're having this conversation 15, 20, 25 years from now, it'll be a completely different conversation about all of these factors. Right. But right now it's a new industry, and you have people who are just impassioned about the plant itself, who are great advocates for the plant, but may not have any real levels of sophistication with business and or science or whatnot. You also see, people who just see an opportunity. They don't care particularly about cannabis or CBD or THC or anything at all, but they just see an opportunity. So they jump in and try to make a quick buck. And then on the flip side of things, I think you see some high level of sophistication, executives from other industries that are coming in, and they do bring that business, but they might not understand the plant piece, whether it be the culture in which it arose, the science piece, how it's being used, how it's being discussed. So I think a lack of sophistication can come on a lot of different levels, but every year it gets better.
It does.
I've noticed that in my years of practicing.
I agree. So talking about, was it maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, you talked about your thoughts for 2020.
Right.
Can you summarize that a little bit? Maybe we can go into a couple of those points.
Yeah, absolutely. I may need to bring them up.
It's all right.
See what I was thinking about at the time to do. In fact, I'll do that while we're talking.
Okay. Yeah.
But looking into the crystal ball is always fun, and it's an exercise to see how right you are, because it's impossible, of course, to have to predict things and be exactly right. Certainly not without a lot of luck. Okay, so I just pulled up my blog post. So I'm happy to just walk through them and give a little bit of context to
go
it.
for it. I'm pulling it up here.
So the top one will be that CBD will go mainstream. And that sounds ridiculous. How more mainstream could it be? It's like if you're in the grocery store, it's on every, the cover of 3 out of 5 magazines, and everyone's mother and grandmother is using it. But when you look at the charts and the graphs as to who's used it, who's been exposed to it, and who is likely to use it, we're at the beginning of the beginning. We really are in the stage of just the early adopters. And so the mainstream has not adopted it yet. And that's going to happen. I think we're going to see it happen in a lot of ways through the topical piece. And so hemp-derived topicals, cosmetics that contain CBD and that do not make medical claims are not prohibited at all by the FDA. And so we're going to see a lot of big multinational publicly traded companies move into that space. We've already seen it on some level. And so that's giving more access to it. And then I think we're going to see, more in the way of ingestibles, on the market, and them being more regulated. So we're just going to see a lot more CBD. That's for sure.
So on that, can I friendly challenge you there? Just curious.
Challenge me. Absolutely.
I just made that up. That sounds terrible.
I'm a lawyer. Bring it on. We'll talk it out. Right.
So with, let's see, with what is it, like Google Trends, you can look up almost any topic, and you can see the interest for something. There's some other websites that are similar to that. And so looking at CBD, in the past 5 years, 4 or 5 years ago was really low. Then about 2 years ago, just shot up as far as the percentage of people that were looking for it. And then the past few months, it seems like that's been waning. And that one data point. Then the other is with before we started recording, I mentioned about a few cultivators who have a whole bunch of biomass sitting in a warehouse somewhere, or maybe people that are holding out the crude or distillate. And what we were talking about a year ago, that's like, man, like we got to produce, and all these people are getting into it, and like we need more hemp. And then now it seems like there's people are holding on to stuff, or that they're not selling as much as they thought they would. Not saying that they had any data to back it up. Right. But just curious if like who is selling and maybe who's buying, or I guess will be, right? According to what you're saying, like, in 2020, it'll go mainstream, where it doesn't sometimes being inside, right? I understand that sometimes you got blinders on, like you see your shadow and you're like, oh, that's how it's happening. But it might not be the case, but it's like, maybe what's that difference? Yeah, no,
I think you make really good points, and I can answer it in two different ways. So one is, right, if you look at the Google analytics, CBD in particular has gone from pretty much non-existent in terms of search queries a few years ago to it literally beats out everything except, I think, like Trump and porn or something like that. It's like it's the highest search query for anything,
right?
And it's gone that in a very short period of time, but it has sort of planed off. And what I discuss in my blog post is there's this concept called crossing the chasm, and it was articulated in a book by Jeffrey Moore, and it's actually years and years ago. But crossing the chasm talks about the cycle of new products, and it says it divides the life cycle of products into innovators, early adopters, main majority on the early side, the main majority on the mature side, and then late adopters, and then laggards. And it's a bell curve. And the chasm usually occurs after the early adopter period, but before the main sort of early majority. And what you see is this bell curve going up. And then after the early adopters, there's usually a dip, and they call that the chasm. And it's sort of the calm before the storm. And then that's where the main majority takes off. And from a percentage piece, the innovators and the early adopters represent about 15% of the total amount of consumers that will eventually be using the product. And so where we are now, based on a lot of data, even though we seem to see it everywhere, we're still at only maybe 15% penetration of the market. And I think we can say the data points projecting, the billions of sales over the next 5-10 years or whatever it's going to be are accurate, because there is an ever growing interest in cannabis and cannabinoids. This doesn't seem to be something that's just going to go away. So I think one piece with the data point of us in this slow period has to do with that chasm. But the other piece is, you brought up the fact that people are now having a hard time selling their material, their raw material, their hemp itself, the distillates, even the isolates. All the prices are crashing. There's a surplus on the market. And so, how can we talk about this industry expanding when we're looking at people not even be able to sell what they have right now? And I think that just is an immature market. With the supply and the demand side hasn't quite lined up. And we've seen this on a state by state basis as new states will come on, say with a medical or adult use program, suddenly, right off the bat, everything sells out, and then people produce. And then it becomes a glut and the prices drop, and then certain producers will go out of business. And in Colorado, there were a lot of businesses that went out until that stabilized. And so I do think that this is not what we're seeing in terms of sales is not that CBD and cannabis products are not going to be penetrating the market more. It's just that our supply chain and the demand side is not matched up yet. So it's just inventory we got to go through.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
So moving on, I guess if you want to still kind of take the path of some predictions, I see that track and trace and GMP will really finally become the norm. And this is how it should be. I mean, any kind of consumer product, certainly products that we ingest or use on our bodies, you can expect, you just expect that they were made in compliant, safe, sanitary conditions, and that you can track and trace the product. If there's some product some batch that has a problem with it, that should be able to be recalled with, not a whole lot of fanfare. Bam, they identify this is where those products went, send out the recall and bring it back. But to date, we haven't seen that certainly not on a large scale with the industry.
Right.
And it's matured to the point where that's going to be necessary to go forward. So if you're not already working with or moving your manufacturing to be CGMP, you need to track and trace from seed to sale, and that can be at all different levels. And certainly with respect to if you're a manufacturer, your batch testing has to be there. You've got to be able to now work on shelf stability studies and how to do a full recall if you need to, and so on and so forth.
Do you think that that's something that the consumer cares about, or is that more the government?
I think both. The governments, or where we talk about the federal government, the state governments, do care. A lot of the consumer protections are getting defunded in various ways with the current administration, and that's another conversation. But from a regulatory standpoint, it does matter and it's going to be required. But I think consumers care about that. Consumers may not be conscious of it, but it's if they're not consciously looking for products that have these certifications or were made in these circumstances, they're assuming that they were. I mean, I don't think anyone's like, hey, I'm going to go out and look for the product that was made in someone's dirty basement. So I do think consumers care whether or not they, are fully conscious or articulate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I believe that. I think it's one of those where it takes a horrible event to occur before the regular consumer is like, oh, wow. I wonder if, these other companies will track or let me know where stuff came from.
It's too bad that is often the case. You're exactly right. Yeah. Someone gets hurt, and that's the thing that brings attention to it.
Or like a major news organization says like, oh, we're going to test these products, and then a few companies get a black eye, and
they do. And I've been involved, frankly, with some clients who underwent that process, and it's never pretty because those are never about hey, here's the best of the best. It's always we're trying to bring someone down.
Yeah.
And what I've found is that the testing protocols that those TV stations or news organizations use are often the wrong ones, or they're not taking into account all the different issues. So, for example, I've seen these sort of expose news reports where they'll pull a series of gummies. Well, a pack of gummies, we don't know if it's been properly stored, how old it is, if the bag's been shaken around, if the gummies are infused with CBD or they're sprayed with CBD or powdered with it. There's all these different circumstances. And are you looking at the CBD for the whole pack, or is it per gummy? So all of these things are getting better from a manufacturing standpoint, as they have to. But those exposés often and unfortunately can't be relied upon either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because something like that comes out. It almost in a way it tells me that sensationalism is more important than, let's say, research or hard evidence. Because, we have so many research, studies, and not all great, but there's so much research on, let's say, CBD, THC. But it's a lot of folks say, well, it's not enough. Like, we need more. And sure, we need to understand the plant more, but there's still a lot of information out there.
So much information.
But it doesn't come to like a specific point about cannabis doesn't come to the forefront of the consumer's mind until some TV station says, hey, look at this awful thing that happened, and somebody, whatever. And that's when people are like, oh my God. And, politicians like, we got to close this down. And, it's just like that, the drama, or just like that, wow, look at this ugly pimple on that face. We got to take care of that. Like, that's when people take action, it seems like.
That's when they take action. Absolutely. And it's, it makes sense, but it's also unfortunate. And a lot of times when you talk about the government, regulators coming in, a lot of times they do the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. So, one example of that is the whole vaping crisis that came down. And so, there are a lot of different factors involved, but essentially what was happening is that, black market, for the most part, THC products were being, mixed with vitamin E acetate in order to stretch the supply and be able to sell them for cheaper and sell more, so on and so forth. And that was causing a lot of harm and even some deaths. Now, there also could be cheaply made batteries and other things like that were emitting some carcinogenic substances. But by and large, that's what was happening. Well, when it came to the regulators, what the regulators do is they said, no more flavored vapes for nicotine. which I'm not sure there was ever any connection at all established between flavored nicotine vapes and the deaths that were occurring. But that's what the regulators did. It served some other political purposes, and we see that happen a lot too. And that can be frustrating. That's not to say, I'm not taking a position one way or the other about nicotine. I don't do that area of law and flavored vapes, but just to see that there was a pretty clear identification of what the problem was, and there were ways that the regulators could have gone about addressing it, and they went in an entirely different direction.
Yeah. It's still important to talk to the consumer and educate people.
Yeah.
That's still one of the biggest things. So then tracking, do you think blockchain has a place in this whole tracking? I don't know how familiar you are with. I'm a super duper amateur when it comes to blockchain, but I've had numerous conversations with some really, really bright people. And I think blockchain is something that is not only would be helpful to the cannabis industry, but I think it's probably inevitable that that's going to play a part on the supply chain side at some point. I think the real issue is companies, and in particular consumers, being able to access and use that. And I don't think there's a platform that I'm aware of yet that allows either. And I think once that evolves, I think we'll start to see blockchain being used more. Yeah. Okay. So then number 3, emergence of and availability of other cannabinoids on the market.
Yeah. So novel cannabinoids is something that really is interesting to me, because THC, of course, everyone knows about. CBD now, most people know about. But as you well know, there are dozens, over 100 other cannabinoids. Before recording, we were talking about the discovery of the THCP and the CBDP, and we just discovered that within the past few weeks. So there's all these cannabinoids, but then there's also terpenes, and then there's also combinations and what they can do. So this is where the beginning of the beginning. But I think that what we're going to see over the next 12 to 24 months is the emergence of CBG. That's not a household name, but within the industry it is, and also CBC. And CBN are the most likely next candidates, with the possibility of THCV as well. A lot of this depends on traction that can be garnered in the consumer market, but also the ability to harvest these cannabinoids, so to speak, to grow genetics that can be rich in a lot of these cannabinoids, but also to be able to extract them. You can't really grow a CBN rich plant. It just doesn't work that way. So a lot of it has to do with how do you extract or convert other cannabinoids to CBN. Whereas CBG has a lot to do with genetics, and also when you would harvest, you'd harvest it earlier usually than if you were growing for THC or CBD, because CBG is the precursor. So anyway, the point is we're going to see new and novel cannabinoids that actually hit the market, I think, within the next year.
Yeah, I think those companies will have a good advantage if they can market it properly, right? Because I think people, like you're saying, there's still a minority of people that are using CBD, and some people still don't know what CBD is. A lot of people still don't know. Right. So to go from, don't worry about CBD, just, for now, let's talk about CBG or V or whatever. It's like that education or possibly marketing piece. And, it'll take somebody to do that well if it doesn't go viral.
Absolutely. And I don't think that people should expect that CBG will ever go viral in the same way. CBG is not just another CBD. It's not going to be that, 2 years from now, it's going to be on the cover of every magazine in the grocery store. I don't think that's the way CBG is going to go. I think it's going to be used more clinically. And then also I think it's going to be an add-on to consumer products that we already see now with CBG, and then maybe talks about the synergistic effect that CBG has when used with different concentrations of CBD and so on.
Okay. Cool. What's next?
Let's see. An international cannabis market will finally emerge. Now, we touched on that briefly, but what we're seeing is that other countries are following the United States. Some countries are leading the United States in certain respects, but we know that Europe in particular is very involved in there's the beginnings of a revolution in cannabis that's happening in Europe right now, particularly with medical cannabis, CBD, and even hemp. And we have the big obstacle for CBD in particular is the EU novel foods laws that say that in order for there to be a new ingredient in foods, there's an application process, and it can take 1 to 3 years and lots of money. It's roughly analogous to the sort of the FDA's position, but in any event, that doesn't mean that raw products. Raw CBD can't be necessarily shipped into Europe. Some countries are more stringent about this than others, and so on and so forth. Also, South America. Now there's several countries that are online where it's lawful to grow all different forms of cannabis, and a lot of that is being grown not for the internal market. Might be a small country like Uruguay, but for the world market. They're wanting to supply the medical market in Germany, for instance, or something like that. So I think we're going to see a big emergence of cannabis as an international commodity, and particularly hemp and CBD this coming year.
That's really interesting. So from a strategy perspective, how do you start to consider that? Is it where you say, well, I want to export to, before we were talking about Africa, I want to export to Africa,
right?
Or do you need to have let's say marketing and ad spend already, what it's like the chicken or the egg. Where do you start?
It really is. And it's hard to say. Kind of obviously depends on where you are in the supply chain. Are you a producer? Are you a manufacturer? Are you doing something else? But I think you identify the region that you want to start with, or regions. And typically it means identifying the supply chain partners you need. So if you are producing, for example, CBD isolate, and you're wanting to put that in say Kentucky or Colorado or wherever, and you're wanting that to ship that into Germany or into Spain or into some other country, well, that's great, but you need to find your distribution partners first, I think. And so I think you need to find that counterpart in that other country that's going to connect with your supply chain. And then from that relationship, you can begin to form your strategy for getting the product over there, and also, work your way through the regulatory hurdles and issues. And this is a very new area. Certainly import export's been around for centuries. That's the way, the world commerce grows, and it's got its own complexities. But in terms of cannabis and cannabis derivatives, there are all sorts of different layers and complications. So this is a very new issue, and it's very exciting to me.
So it seems almost like it's one of those where you have to know someone, like you have to have a connection to say, okay, well, I want to start to export to Uruguay. Like I have to, let's say from the perspective of maybe a cultivator in North America,
right?
Like, okay, well, there's somebody in Uruguay that can sell it somewhere. So, but I can provide good quality hemp. Right. Is that kind of what you see, or? Yeah,
having that relationship or relationships is vital. Mm-hmm. I think just saying I want to grow a product or make a product and sell it in Europe or in South America or Mexico or wherever, unfortunately isn't good enough. You've got to have that counterpart. Yeah. And that can be because your life experience in your prior career or growing up or whatever, you have, participants and people that or because you go out and find them. Mm-hmm. Now there are beginning to be more and more conferences about cannabis and cannabis related products in the international space. And so I see more and more people are traveling to those and speaking at them. And we're certainly going to be speaking at several international conferences this year. Okay,
cool. Do you have any scheduled coming up?
Yeah, I'm going to be in Dublin the first week of March, and then in France speaking at an international cannabis conference in Paris in July, and possibly one in Israel this spring. I don't have that one pinned down yet.
Okay, cool. That sounds pretty exciting. All right, international, and then this one. This is very exciting right here. Number 5.
Yeah, we'll see the first wave of cannabis insolvencies and bankruptcies. And I have to say, this one has already been proven true. So we've got Gincana has filed bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. And so, this is, again, we were talking about the market and it being an immature market and all sorts of, inefficiencies and whatnot. Well, part of any market, any product category, any industry has to do with insolvencies and bankruptcies and things like that. That's just part of a mature market. And we haven't seen that to date until this year. And I think a lot of the pricing drops that we were talking about earlier are going to contribute to companies being overextended. Now, an issue, and I'm in my prior legal career, I was a bankruptcy specialist. So this is something that I'm familiar with. And I think it's going to be interesting because when we talk about marijuana companies cannot file bankruptcy because it's federally illegal. So what they do is federally illegal. And whether it's a liquidation where a federal agent, a bankruptcy trustee would have to liquidate products that are federally illegal, that can't happen. Or whether it's a company that just needs to reorganize its debt structure, arguably that can't be done either, because again, they're asking federal courts to apply federal laws to an operation that is federally illegal. And so that's, when in terms of marijuana companies, we won't see bankruptcies just yet, but there is a state counterpart that can be called a receivership, that where we can see sort of bankruptcy-esque proceedings. When it comes to hemp, though, as I said with the Gincana, we are going to start to see some bankruptcies. That is federally legal industry, and so the bankruptcy law is going to apply. The only thing that I think that will slow that down a little bit is that, frankly, a lot of the debt that's usually associated or always associated with bankruptcy cases has not been issued, because banks have only until very recently been willing to issue debt. So I think a lot of the bankruptcies will have to do with private lenders and private investors and vendors that weren't paid and so on and so forth, versus a more standard bankruptcy where you're seeing institutional lenders involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and banks are still starting to kind of get on that. We, for a small reason, we had to go find a bank, and we had to go through 15 plus banks just to try to find somebody that would be willing to work with us.
Absolutely. And they're changing, banks, so I've seen banks that were sort of hemp friendly-ish, at least. And now they're coming back and kicking people out, or saying, well, you can stay on, but you can't sell X, Y, and Z types of products. And so, banks are struggling to comply with what they perceive as the appropriate regulations, and how they're applied to their banks. So it's banking still is in its infancy with cannabis at large, and even with hemp, and lending follows that. So we're still in the very, very infancy stages of lending with cannabis businesses. I
just heard somebody saying, it sounded so ridiculous, that their bank found out that they were dealing with biomass, and that they charged them, I think it was like $300-$400, and closed their account.
Gosh, really?
So it's like they kicked them in the teeth on their way out.
On their way out, right? Like, give us your money and get out, right? It's awful. Fortunately, there are some banks that are actively courting the hemp sector and trying to do it right. And I think ultimately it'll be the case with all financial institutions. But I encourage people to go and support those banks. Yeah. A lot of times they're regional or even state specific banks, and it may be a little more inefficient to work with them than working with some national bank that has an ATM on every corner. But these smaller regional banks that are actively courting the hemp industry, they're the ones that are doing it right. They are in the same position as a lot of hemp companies are. They're out trying to do the right thing and to carve a niche. And I think we should support that for sure.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. So then last question here before you get to go in the next few minutes. So talked about a few things coming up for 2020. Do you feel like there are any, let's say, open opportunities or places in the hemp industry where there's very little activity in, but potentially high rewards that people are not really going after?
That's great. So high rewards are typically associated with high risk. Yeah. So I'll preface that. One thing that I think
you're a lawyer, you have to say that.
I have to say that. I've got to have the lawyer thing. Don't rely on me. This is not investment advice or anything. One thing that I've seen and we've already talked about, and that is the need for analytical laboratory testing. There are a handful of really good, high quality analytical labs, and I want them to continue to grow and do well. I know a lot of the principals of those labs and the founders, and they're doing a great job, but they just cannot handle the volume. And so I think there's a real opportunity to engage in the hemp industry at this stage by being an analytical lab. Now that's tough. I mean, that's a very small segment of people, and that can get involved in that because it's capital intensive. It usually not usually, you have to have, personnel that can do it right. And that's scientific training and everything else. So that's can be a difficult opportunity to get involved in, but I think that's a good one. On the other side, we've already talked about as well. And I think that's the international piece, and that's high risk, high reward, because it's risky. You could spend a year trying to put all the pieces together and nothing ever happened. There's too many failure points in a typical scenario right now, trying to export your product to a foreign country. That being said, if you're able to do it successfully and grab a big piece of that pie, it could be highly profitable.
Okay. Are there 2 or 3 countries that if you're considering international, that you should say like, okay, you can consider these as a initial path? Yeah,
this is something that I'm asked a lot about with clients, and it's changing rapidly, and there's no sort of absolute. Germany seems to be poised to really open up its medical marijuana program, and there are going to be some opportunities there. So
I think they're the only ones that so far that I've heard that their insurance will reimburse for marijuana usage.
Right. At some Scandinavian countries, it's not marijuana, but I believe it's with CBD or hemp may as well. But Germany is moving in that direction. And of course, Germany is going to be leading the rest of Europe in that respect. I think Spain and Italy have a little more grayer markets, but also are a little more tolerant. So that's, in some ways, it's like the US. It's not, a lot of things are not prohibited, but they're not expressly authorized, or the rules are a little bit difficult to navigate. Britain seems to be very much at the forefront, at least with respect to hemp and CBD. It's just gone through Brexit, and it's going through a lot of adjustments. And so we'll see how rapidly it's able to ramp things up. I think that Mexico is in this position where it has, you have this 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so I feel like I'm constantly getting excited about Mexico, and then, finding out, no, we're not quite there yet. This, that, or the other has to happen before we can do it. But I think that it will not be too long before Mexico will be a good export market as well.
Do I understand this correctly, that some of the reasons that folks outside of the US will purchase US, let's call it CBD or hemp, is because the people believe that the quality from US products is better than what's in their native country?
I think that's one of them. One of the main reasons is that the quality is there. And so that's yet another reason to be focused on quality and quality standards and regulations in the US, because that's a big sell that the US has that some countries don't have. And I think also it's just that the supply chain and the infrastructure is not there yet in some of these other countries. And importing US goods of whatever commodities or finished products or whatnot in the cannabis space into these other countries a lot of times is a surrogate for infrastructure that doesn't exist. Sometimes it's priming the pump to get things moving in that country. Okay, good deal. So let's see, we got a couple minutes before you have to run. So where can folks find you? Yeah, sure. So Rod Kight, Kight, it's like night, but with a K instead of an N. And you can go to kightoncannabis.com. And that is my legal blog. And we try to keep articles up, 1 to 2 articles per week. We're less about trying to break every little story that comes out than we are about taking an issue and really analyzing it and providing helpful information to readers. And so you can email me, rod@cannabusiness.law, or give us a call, 828-255-9881. Fantastic. So thank you again. This is our second podcast. I'll link to all those things in the show notes. Always love talking to you. I think you have some great insights. You offer a lot of value. And I hope that people will at least subscribe to the blog. I think you're on LinkedIn, and of course you have the email newsletter. And then of course, if anybody has any questions, that they should be able to reach out to you, which I would encourage them that they do. I think you have some good things to say. Well, I appreciate that. I always enjoy speaking with you. You've got some really good insights yourself, so it's always a fun conversation. So, and then let me know when you're going to put out your podcast, the night or the podcast of the hemp cannabis or right. I will. I'll put that out there for sure. So we're about to do a little bit of a website restructure to include a special place for videos and podcasts like this that people can find in addition to the blog. So because you do so many conferences and so many speaking gigs, set up a camera and just. I know, right? I need to do that. At least the ones where I don't look like an idiot. Have my hair's brushed right or whatnot. So no, I think that's a great idea. So we want to be able to provide additional resources where people can go and say, here's a podcast with Rod talking with Jason and about X, Y, and Z. I think I'll listen to that. So we're hoping to get to a place where the website's really easy to navigate for those types of things. Cool. Looking forward to it. So Thank you so much. Thanks so much. Hey guys, and before you go, this is Jason from Spectrum Labs. Please be sure to visit us on the web at thespectrumlabs.com for any show notes and links discussed in the podcast. Also, remember to click the subscribe button wherever you may be listening from so you get notified when our next episode comes out. And tune in next show and have a fantastic day.